Many of the flesh fields were still automated, mechanical limbs speeding through the gloom, spraying the vats with nutrients, lifting crops and depositing fresh stem stock, all with the minimum of human input. But the machines were ancient, and nothing lasted forever. Gradually, year by year, more of the flesh farming industry was losing its automation. Software was often the root of the problem. They could repair and replace components, but sooner or later the changing nature of the machine would collide violently with its untouched, unmodified software, code like mystical runes written in languages nobody could remember. Accidents would happen. In the summer of the year of the Flame 1027, a loading machine spontaneously forgot the existence of its load. It dropped a fully laden vat on 3 men, crushing them beneath the weight of both metal and meat. 1 week later, another man lost his arm when a mechanized guillotine failed to identify an obstruction and set about deftly slicing the crop ready for harvest. These were not isolated incidents. The farmers were bleeding on their fields of flesh, and yet in spite of this, their bodies were outnumbered. Plantation by plantation, company by company, automation was being retired, first as a result of technical failure and injury, then in anticipation of it. And as once machine-dominated roles were handed back to the humans, human nature ensured that the transition would never be easy. Traditionally, the fields were tended to by the Corks, the core kin, they of pale skin and dark eyes, who lived quietly in half-hidden communities down in the deeper tunnels, having done so since the earliest days. The ways of the core kin were older than the ancient plantation machines, while the people of the leanings and the upper streets had grown accustomed to the knowledge that life existed beyond the city, that it had grown numerous and cheap. The Corks still lived as if humanity were in danger of vanishing, as if they were the only humans left. They wasted nothing, valued life, and taught their children that contribution was continuity, that mankind would only survive if it earned that right. Reserved, reasonable, frugal, and patient, the Cork population was unsurprisingly low. Thus, with automation of the fields waning, new farmers were needed, and most of them were recruited from the dappled sunlight of the leanings high above. Such new recruits had spent most of their lives with the reassuring cycle of day and night, artificial though it may have been. They were unaccustomed to the perpetual darkness of the plantation caverns. When the first team of new recruits was trained on the Fairbanks plantation that year, half of them promptly developed insomnia and, over time, vitamin deficiency, while several became so emotionally unstable they were dangerous to work with. Some of the men told stories of otherwise cheerful and benign colleagues who had started beating their wives and children in fits of sleep-deprived madness. Then, of course, there was the incident with Frederick Harris. "I do believe I got some Fred in my lunch today." Gallows humor, big laughs all around. Frederick Harris was another victim of the fields. Mistakenly believing that drink would help him sleep, he wandered the plantation late one night, lost in an amber haze. He slipped, cracked his head, fell into a vat and drowned in the meat, unconscious and unnoticed. By the time his body was found, the meat had fed upon the corpse like any other source of nutrients. Frederick Harris had become part of the meat. The whole vat had to be emptied, for its crop could no longer pass DNA standards for the human content threshold. The men who tended to that particular grid lost a month's pay, such was the value of the crop, and Frederick Harris was doomed to be remembered with bitterness. He was not alone. Organized crime in the city had long since learned a valuable lesson about the meat farming industry, that the meat did not merely dissolve and absorb organic matter, it merged with that matter. It reassembled as it consumed, turning the corpse into more of itself. Thus, even if a body hadn't dissolved fully before it was recovered, contamination from the meat meant that DNA testing of the corpse would never stand up in court. It was perfect. Dumping a body in the vats meant erasing a person, turning them, quite literally, into raw meat. Or, as they had come to be known, sandwich men. This was what the farmers called them, so numerous were the bodies that the horror of their discovery was worn down into a grim joke. It became an inevitability of the farming process and part of the daily routine to walk the gantries inspecting the greasy grey-pink fields for the telltale signs of a sandwich man. A stray shoe, perhaps, or a subtle indentation left by a recent fall, or a hand protruding from that sea of meat as if pitifully waving for assistance. At midday on the 16th of August, Samuel Knott strolled across the fields performing said inspection, and with keen eyes scanned the glistening surfaces of the vats for said signs. It wasn't his grid, but he'd been working the fields for nearly 20 years and felt responsible for the plantation as a whole. Not that management had ever seen fit to match his pay or status to this responsibility. He didn't mind. Until lately the pay had been steady, and that was what mattered. Sam knew he was never destined for greatness. He knew he would never be remembered by history, but he had a wife and 2 children, and he had dutifully provided for them without fail or complaint, until lately. Until the bodies began appearing in greater numbers, until management, without spending so much as a single extra penny on security, decided that their policy would focus on human error, namely the mistaken diligence of the farmers whenever they dredged up a corpse and correctly forced management to dump the meat by filing the proper paperwork. The message was clear. Whosoever pulls a sandwich man from his crop shall forfeit the value of that crop in pay. This was not official, nor even strictly legal, but it was understood. Management truly believed that its deniability was plausible, that the Fairbanks plantation, wholly owned subsidiary of the great Fairbanks shareholder family, was not responsible for the contamination of crops by unauthorized organic incursion, but was simultaneously dedicated to its adherence to all anti-cannibalism regulations within the meat farming industry. So it was with bitter disappointment that Samuel Knott came to lean against the railing, peer over the gantry of the vat below, and set eyes upon the human form spread-eagled in the meat. And though he had seen so many sandwich men as to render his stomach ironclad and his dreams blissfully free of death, fate saw fit to grant him that which all sensible men dread. Something new.